My daughter pointed at a stranger standing at the front of her second-grade classroom on career day, tugged on my sleeve so hard I nearly dropped my coffee, and whispered 5 words that made my entire chest go cold. "That's Dad's Vivian." I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in 11 years, and for a moment I genuinely could not remember how to breathe, because the woman standing at that podium, laughing gently at something another parent had said, was supposed to be a ghost I had buried a long time ago, not a person my 8-year-old daughter could somehow recognize on sight. If you believe that people deserve second chances, that old wounds can be healed instead of hidden, and that forgiveness is one of the bravest things a human being can offer another, I'd like to ask you for something small before we go any further into this story. Please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment about a time forgiveness changed your life, share this with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our community exists because people like you show up for stories about second chances, and this one is going to need every bit of that hope by the time we're finished. My name is Nathaniel Cross, though everyone except my late wife's mother has always called me Nate, and I have spent the better part of the last decade building a quiet, careful life for my daughter Poppy in a small town called Ashford Hollow, the kind of place with one traffic light, a diner that still serves pie on real plates, and a school small enough that every parent knows every teacher by first name. I run the auto shop my father left me, the same one where I learned to change oil before I learned long division, and most days that shop is the loudest and most complicated thing in my life, which is exactly how I wanted it after everything that happened when I was 26 years old. Poppy is 8, sharp as a tack, endlessly curious, and she has my late wife Colleen's eyes, which is both the greatest gift and the quietest ache I carry every single day, because Colleen died 3 years ago from a heart condition none of us knew she had until it was too late, and since then it has just been the two of us, learning how to be a family with one fewer chair at the table. Career day at Ashford Hollow Elementary is usually the kind of event I can predict down to the letter. A dentist talks about cavities while handing out miniature toothbrushes. A firefighter lets the kids sit in the truck. A local farmer brings a lamb that the entire second grade talks about for a week. I had signed up months earlier to talk about being a mechanic, mostly because Poppy had begged me to, proud in that specific way only an 8-year-old can be proud of her father's calloused hands and grease-stained coveralls, and I had agreed because saying no to that particular kind of pride felt like a crime against something sacred. I walked into that gymnasium that Tuesday morning with a toolbox full of small engine parts and absolutely no warning that my past was about to walk in right behind me wearing a paramedic's uniform. I saw her before Poppy did, if I am being honest, though it took my brain several long seconds to catch up with what my eyes were telling me. She had cut her hair shorter than she used to wear it, and there were a few silver threads near her temples that had not been there the last time I saw her, but the way she stood, weight shifted onto one hip, chin tilted slightly when she listened to someone talk, that had not changed one single bit in 11 years. Vivian Hale. The woman I had once promised to marry. The woman I had once accused of something so ugly that she left our town in the middle of the night without so much as a note, and the woman I had spent over a decade trying very hard not to think about, mostly by refusing to think about anything from that entire period of my life at all. Poppy's whisper landed in my ear like a small earthquake. She did not know the history, of course. She only knew what she had found 3 weeks earlier while looking for tape in the bottom drawer of my dresser, a photograph I had never had the heart to throw away and never had the courage to look at either, tucked beneath old warranty papers and a broken watch that used to be my father's. In the photograph, a much younger version of me stood with my arm around a laughing young woman on the edge of Miller's Creek, both of us soaked from swimming, both of us looking like the kind of happy that believes it will last forever. Poppy had asked me who the woman was, and because I did not know how to explain heartbreak to a 7-year-old, I had simply told her, "That's Vivian, someone I used to know a long time ago," and then I had gently taken the photograph, kissed the top of her head, and put it back exactly where I had found it, hoping the conversation was closed forever. Children, it turns out, remember faces far better than adults give them credit for, and apparently 8-year-old Poppy Cross had just spotted, from 30 feet away, in a gymnasium full of parents she had never met, the exact same face from that photograph, now standing in front of a poster about emergency medical services. I want to tell you that I handled that moment with grace. I did not. I stood frozen next to a table displaying a disassembled carburetor while my daughter looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, waiting for some kind of explanation, and all I could manage was a strangled, "It's okay, sweetheart, just, let's go look at the fire truck," which of course did nothing except make an 8-year-old more curious, not less. Vivian's presentation was scheduled for the group after mine, which meant I had exactly 40 minutes to compose myself, explain small engines to a room of children who mostly wanted to know if I had ever fixed a race car, and pretend that my hands were not shaking every time I glanced toward the woman across the gymnasium who had once been the entire architecture of my future. To understand why the sight of Vivian Hale nearly knocked the air out of my lungs, you have to go back with me 11 years, to a summer that started as the best of my life and ended as the worst. Vivian and I grew up 2 streets apart in Ashford Hollow, though we did not become close until our early 20s, when she started working weekends at the diner and I started finding excuses to eat lunch there far more often than any reasonable person needs to eat lunch out. She had a laugh that made strangers turn their heads in restaurants, and she had a way of looking at broken things, whether it was an old truck engine or a person having a hard day, and seeing exactly what needed fixing instead of what was already wrong. We fell in love the way people do in small towns, slowly and then all at once, and by the time I was 25 I had already picked out the ring, hidden in a coffee can in my father's garage, waiting for the right moment. My younger brother Callum was 22 that summer, restless in the way a lot of young men are restless in towns too small to hold their ambitions, and he had fallen in with a rougher crowd from the next county over, coming home some nights smelling like cigarettes and cheap whiskey, refusing to answer questions, testing every boundary our aging father tried to set. My father owned a small storage warehouse on the edge of town where he kept extra parts, old furniture, and, that particular summer, several $1,000s worth of restored antique tractors he had been slowly fixing up to sell at auction, a project that represented not just money but pride, the culmination of decades of patient work. Late one August night, that warehouse burned to the ground. The fire department said it started near the back corner, close to where my father kept a stash of old rags soaked in engine solvent, the kind of thing that can combust under the wrong conditions if handled carelessly, and in the chaotic days afterward, as my father stood in the ashes of his life's project, someone needed to be blamed, because grief without a target feels unbearable, and Vivian had been seen near that warehouse 2 nights before the fire, borrowing a wrench for her own car. Something she had done a dozen times before without incident. I want to be honest with you about the version of myself that existed that summer, because he is not a version I am proud of. I was exhausted, frightened for my father's health after the shock of the fire nearly put him in the hospital, and desperate for an explanation that did not point toward my own brother, who I would later learn had been smoking behind that warehouse with his rough new friends the very night it burned, flicking a cigarette into a pile of solvent-soaked rags on his way out, panicking, and saying absolutely nothing to anyone as the flames spread. Callum let Vivian take the suspicion because he was terrified of what our father would do if he learned the truth, and because, I think, some small selfish part of him believed the town's memory was short and the whole thing would blow over. It did not blow over for Vivian. Rumors in a town the size of Ashford Hollow spread faster than the fire itself did, and within a week people were crossing the street to avoid her, whispering behind her back at the very diner where she had worked so hard, and I, the man who was supposed to love her more than anyone, the man who held that ring in a coffee can in the garage, looked at her one terrible afternoon on my father's porch and asked her, in a voice I still hear sometimes in my quietest moments, whether she had anything to do with what happened to his warehouse. She did not yell at me. That is the part that has haunted me the longest. She simply looked at me for a long moment, her eyes filling with a hurt so deep it seemed to fold in on itself, and she said, "If you have to ask me that, Nate, then you never really knew me at all," and she walked away from my father's porch and, as it turned out, from Ashford Hollow itself. 3 days later her mother told mine that Vivian had taken a job clear across the state, training to become an EMT, and just like that she was gone, without a goodbye, without an address, without a single opportunity for me to take back the worst question I had ever asked another human being. I told myself for years that she left because she was guilty. It was easier than the alternative, which was that she left because I had broken something in her that no amount of apology could ever repair, and I had been too proud and too afraid to chase after her and find out which story was true. Standing in that gymnasium 11 years later, watching her set up a small display about emergency medicine for a room full of second graders, I understood with sudden, sickening clarity that I had never actually resolved a single piece of that story in my own heart. I had simply packed it away, the way you might pack away a photograph in the bottom of a dresser drawer, and gone on living as though the box would stay shut forever. Poppy, of course, had no such box. She had only curiosity, and love for her father, and an 8-year-old's total inability to let a mystery lie quiet once she had spotted it. When my own presentation ended, to a chorus of polite applause and one boy earnestly asking if I could fix his mother's minivan for free, I ushered Poppy toward the little chairs set up for the next speaker, my heart hammering so hard I was sure she could hear it. Vivian stepped up to the front of the room, and for one suspended moment our eyes met across all those small, restless heads, and I watched something shift across her face, surprise first, then something more complicated, something that looked almost like she had been slapped and steadied herself all in the same breath. She recovered faster than I did. She always had been better under pressure than me. It was, I would later learn, half the reason she had become so good at her job. She spoke to the children about what it meant to be a paramedic, about staying calm when everyone around you is frightened, about the difference between being brave and simply refusing to let fear make your decisions for you, and though she was speaking to a room of 8-year-olds, I felt every single word land somewhere much deeper in my chest, as if she were speaking directly and only to me. Poppy sat rapt, chin in her hands, and at the end of the presentation, when Vivian asked if anyone had questions, my daughter's hand shot up before I could stop it. "Are you Dad's Vivian?" she asked, in the clear, carrying voice children use without any concept of consequence, and the entire gymnasium seemed to hold its breath for a heartbeat before dissolving into the confused, giggling noise of children who did not understand what they had just witnessed, while every adult in that room who had lived in Ashford Hollow for more than a decade understood exactly what they had just witnessed. Vivian's composure cracked only slightly, a small intake of breath, a flicker of something raw behind her eyes, before she knelt down to Poppy's level with a gentleness that told me, even in that mortifying instant, that whatever else had changed about her, her heart had not hardened the way mine had. "I used to know your dad a long time ago," she said softly, "back before you were even a thought in the world. What's your name?" Poppy told her, proud and unbothered, the way children are proud and unbothered about everything, and Vivian smiled at her, a real smile, though I could see the effort it cost her, and said, "Poppy. That's a beautiful name. You've got sharp eyes, you know that? Sharper than most grown-ups I meet." I do not fully remember walking out of that gymnasium. I remember Poppy chattering happily about her day, about the fire truck and the lamb and the woman who used to know her father, entirely unaware that she had just cracked open a wound 11 years deep, and I remember driving home on autopilot, hands tight on the steering wheel, replaying that one sentence over and over, "If you have to ask me that, Nate, then you never really knew me at all." I had believed, for over a decade, that Vivian Hale had left Ashford Hollow because she was guilty of something. Seeing her again, watching the careful, controlled way she had knelt down to speak to my daughter, I suddenly was not sure of anything I had believed for 11 years, and that uncertainty felt like standing on ice I had trusted my whole life, only to hear it crack beneath my feet for the first time. That evening, after Poppy was tucked into bed with far more questions about Vivian than I had answers for, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and pulled that old photograph out of the dresser drawer for the first time in years. Two young people, soaking wet and laughing, believing the world owed them nothing but happiness. I turned it over, and on the back, in Vivian's looping handwriting, were words I had forgotten were even there: "Some days are just too good to let slip away. Love always, V." I sat with that photograph for a long time, long enough for the coffee to grow a skin of cold film on top, long enough for the evening light through my kitchen window to shift from gold to gray, and I felt something in me that had been locked tight for 11 years begin, very slowly, to loosen. The next morning I called my brother Callum. We were not close in the way brothers in movies are close, the fire, and everything after it, had left a permanent distance between us, a politeness at holidays that never quite thawed into warmth. Callum was 33 now, married, working steady at the lumber yard 2 towns over, and when he answered the phone and heard the tightness in my voice, he asked immediately if something had happened to Poppy, which told me something important about the kind of man he had actually grown into, whatever guilt he still carried from that summer. I told him I had seen Vivian. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then he said, in a voice smaller than I had heard from him in years, "I always figured that day would come eventually. I think about it more than you'd guess, Nate." I asked him, straight out, no cushioning, whether he had started that fire. I do not know exactly what I expected. Part of me, the part that had spent 11 years needing Vivian to be guilty so that my own cruelty toward her could feel justified, almost hoped he would deny it, would give me some reason to keep believing the story I had built my piece around. Instead, after a silence that felt like it lasted an hour, Callum said, "It was an accident, Nate. I was out back with Denny and Marcus, we were smoking, I flicked it before I even thought about the rags, and by the time I realized what I'd done the whole corner was already catching. I panicked. I ran. And then everybody started saying it was Vivian, and I told myself it would blow over, that nobody would actually believe it for long, and then it kept going, and I was too scared of what Dad would do to me to ever say anything, and then she was just gone, and it felt like it was too late to fix it, and every year that went by it just felt more too late, until I guess I convinced myself it always would be. I sat in my truck outside the shop for a long time after that call ended, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, feeling something between rage and grief and a strange, disorienting relief, the relief of finally understanding a shape that had been hidden in shadow for over a decade. My brother's cowardice, and my father's need for someone to blame, and my own desperate desire for a simple villain in a story that was never simple at all, had combined to destroy the life of a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong except borrow a wrench from the wrong warehouse 2 nights before a fire she had no part in starting. And I had been the one who looked her in the eyes and asked her to prove her innocence to me, as though 11 good months of loving her meant nothing against one bad night's rumor. I did not see Vivian again for nearly 2 weeks after career day, though Poppy asked about her constantly, in the persistent, guileless way children return to things that fascinate them. I told myself I needed time to think, to figure out what I would even say if I found her, but the truth, if I am honest with the same courage Vivian once showed on my father's porch, is that I was afraid. Afraid of what she would say. Afraid that 11 years of silence had calcified into something that could never be softened again. Afraid, mostly, that I did not deserve the chance to apologize, and that showing up to ask for one anyway would be its own kind of selfishness. It was Poppy, in the end, who forced my hand, the way children so often do without meaning to force anything at all. She came home from school one Friday with a flyer for a town health fair happening that Saturday at the community park, sponsored in part by the regional EMS station, and she held it up to me with an expression of pure, uncomplicated hope. "Maybe Dad's Vivian will be there," she said, and something about hearing that phrase again, spoken so easily by a child who had no idea what weight those 3 words carried for her father, made the decision for me in a way that no amount of solitary deliberation over 2 weeks had managed to do. The health fair was exactly the kind of small-town event Ashford Hollow does well, tables set up under white tents in the park, the volunteer fire department letting kids climb into the truck, a table with free blood pressure checks manned by 2 retired nurses who had been checking blood pressures at that same fair for as long as I could remember. And there, at a table with a banner reading Ashford Regional EMS, sleeves rolled up, showing a cluster of kids how to properly wrap a bandage, was Vivian. Poppy took off running toward her before I could stop her, and I watched, my heart in my throat, as Vivian looked up, saw my daughter barreling toward her table, and broke into a smile that was unguarded in a way her expression had not been in that gymnasium 2 weeks earlier. I approached more slowly, giving them a moment, watching Vivian patiently show Poppy how to tie off a bandage on a practice arm, listening to my daughter ask a dozen rapid-fire questions about ambulances and sirens and whether Vivian had ever saved anyone's life, actually saved it, like in the movies. Vivian answered every question with a patience that told me exactly the kind of person she had become in the years I had not been there to witness it, careful and kind and entirely unhurried, the opposite of the small, frightened man I had turned into on that porch 11 years earlier. When she finally looked up and saw me standing a respectful distance away, something passed over her face, not quite a smile, not quite anything I could name, and she said, simply, "Nate." We found a bench at the edge of the park while Poppy went to explore the fire truck with a group of other kids under the watchful eye of a volunteer firefighter, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. The ordinary sounds of the fair, laughter and a distant radio and the clink of a horseshoe game somewhere behind us, filling the silence between two people who had once known each other's hearts better than their own. I was the one who finally spoke, and what came out was not the careful speech I had rehearsed a dozen times in my truck over the previous 2 weeks, but something rawer, something that had clearly been waiting a very long time to be said. "I talked to Callum," I told her. "He told me the truth about the fire. I know it wasn't you, Vivian. I've known it wasn't you for 11 years, if I'm being honest with myself, and I still asked you that question on my father's porch, and I am so sorry. I don't know how to make 11 years of that kind of sorry sound like enough, but I need you to know that I know, and that I am sorry, more than I have words for." She was quiet for a long time, looking out at the park rather than at me, her hands folded in her lap, and when she finally spoke her voice was steady in a way that told me she had thought about this conversation, or one like it, many times over the years, even if she had never expected to actually have it. "I used to lie awake at night," she said, "furious at this town for believing the worst about me so easily, furious at your father for needing someone to blame, but the person I was angriest at, Nate, the person whose face I saw every single time I closed my eyes, was you. Not because you believed a rumor. Rumors are easy to believe when you're scared and grieving. I could have forgiven that eventually, I think. What I couldn't forgive, what kept me up at night for years, was that you looked at 11 months of loving each other and let one bad rumor outweigh it. You didn't even give me the dignity of defending myself before you condemned me. That's the part that broke something in me. Not the town's whispers. Yours." I did not try to argue with her, or explain myself, or soften what she had just said, because every word of it was true, and I had spent 11 years knowing it was true even when I refused to look at it directly. "You're right," I told her. "I was scared, and my father was falling apart, and I needed someone to be certain about, and I chose the version of certain that was easiest instead of the version that was true. I have thought about that porch almost every day for 11 years, Vivian. I built a whole life trying not to think about it, and it turns out you cannot actually build a life on top of something you refuse to look at. It just sits there underneath everything, quiet, until one day your daughter points at a stranger in a gymnasium and the whole floor gives way." Something in her posture shifted then, some of the careful armor she had walked into that conversation wearing softening just slightly, and she asked me, in a voice that sounded almost afraid of its own question, "Is she happy? Poppy? Is she a happy little girl?" I told her about Colleen, about the heart condition none of us had known about the 3 years since, about learning how to braid hair from internet videos at midnight and how to answer questions about heaven that I did not have good answers for, and Vivian listened with an expression of such genuine, uncomplicated sorrow that I understood, watching her, that whatever anger she still carried toward me personally, it had never once extended toward the idea of me, or of my family, being happy. "I'm so sorry about Colleen," she said, and she meant it, I could hear that she meant it, and something about the simple decency of that sentence, offered freely to a man who had once wronged her so badly, nearly undid me right there on that park bench. We talked for nearly an hour that afternoon, about the years in between, about her work as a paramedic, which she described with a quiet pride that told me she had built exactly the kind of life she deserved to build, saving people on their worst days, steady in a crisis in a way she said she had first learned how to be steady during the worst weeks of her own life. Right after she left Ashford Hollow with nothing but a duffel bag and a wound she did not think would ever close. She told me she had moved back to the region only 8 months earlier, taking a position with the regional EMS station because her mother's health was declining and she wanted to be closer, and she admitted, with a small, rueful laugh, that some part of her had wondered, moving back, whether our paths would eventually cross, and had told herself she was prepared for it, and had discovered in that gymnasium 2 weeks earlier that she had not been prepared for it at all. I do not want to give you the impression that one conversation on a park bench solved 11 years of damage, because it did not, and any story that promised you healing could happen that fast would not be telling you the truth about what real forgiveness actually costs. What that conversation did was crack open a door that had been sealed shut for over a decade, and over the following weeks, Vivian and I found small, careful ways to walk through it. She started stopping by the diner some mornings when I was getting coffee before opening the shop, at first by what both of us pretended was coincidence, and later by what neither of us bothered pretending was anything but choice. Poppy, thrilled beyond measure to have Dad's Vivian reappearing in her life, asked constantly when Vivian might come over for dinner, entirely unaware of the delicate, deliberate pace her father and this woman from his past were navigating, a pace built on the hard-won understanding that trust broken as badly as ours had been could not simply be reassembled overnight, no matter how much either of us might have wanted it to be. The turning point, the moment the whole town finally understood what had actually happened that summer 11 years earlier, came at my father's 70th birthday gathering in early autumn, held at his house with the whole extended family crowded onto the back porch under strings of cafe lights, plates of food balanced on knees, the easy noise of a family that has weathered plenty of ordinary storms together. My father had aged since the fire, softened in ways grief and time tend to soften a man, and though he had never fully forgiven himself for the suspicion that fell on Vivian under his own roof, he had also never quite found the courage to say so out loud, to anyone, including himself. Callum was there with his wife, quieter than usual, and I could see, watching him across the porch, that something in him had been building toward a decision for weeks, ever since our phone call, the way a person sometimes needs an audience of the people they love most in order to finally say the hardest true thing they have ever had to say. He stood up partway through the evening, glass of lemonade in hand, and asked for everyone's attention in a voice that shook slightly, and I watched my father's face shift from mild confusion to something far more alert as Callum began to speak. He told the whole gathered family, in halting, unpolished sentences, about the cigarette, about the panic, about 11 years of silence that had cost an innocent woman her reputation in the only town she had ever called home. He apologized to our father, whose face had gone very pale, for letting him believe, for 11 years, a story that had allowed him to grieve his warehouse without ever having to reckon with his own son's carelessness. And then, turning toward me, though Vivian was not present that evening, he apologized to the memory of her, to the idea of her, asking that I pass along, in whatever way felt right, how sorry he was, and how long overdue that sorrow was. The porch went very quiet after that, the kind of quiet that follows a confession large enough to rearrange a family's understanding of its own history, and then my father did something I had genuinely never seen him do before in 70 years of life. He set down his own drink, walked across the porch, and pulled Callum into an embrace, holding onto him the way you hold onto someone after nearly losing them, and said, in a voice thick with an emotion I rarely saw him show, "Son, that fire took a building. What almost broke this family was never the fire. It was all of us being too proud and too scared to just tell each other the truth. I should have looked harder before I let this town point a finger at anyone. That's on me too, not just on you." Watching my father, a man of few words and fewer apologies, hold his youngest son and share the weight of a mistake that had gone unspoken for over a decade, I understood that whatever had been broken in our family the summer of that fire was, piece by piece, finally being set right. I told Vivian about that evening 2 days later, sitting on her mother's porch swing while Poppy played in the yard with Vivian's mother's elderly dog, and I watched something in her finally, truly release, some tension she had likely been carrying in her shoulders since the night she left Ashford Hollow 11 years earlier without a single word of goodbye to a town that had turned on her so completely. "I never needed your father's apology to know the truth about myself," she told me, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, half laughing at her own tears, "but I won't pretend it doesn't matter, hearing that it finally got said out loud, after all this time. There's a difference between knowing you're innocent and having the people who wronged you finally say so." I told her that I understood, that I had spent 11 years knowing something in my own heart and refusing to say it out loud even to myself, and that if there was one thing this whole strange, painful, unexpected reunion had taught me, it was that the truth left unspoken does not simply disappear, it just waits, patiently, for someone brave enough, or sometimes young enough, to point at it and say its name. If this story has moved you at all, I would love for you to take a moment and leave a comment below about a time you had to forgive someone, or a time someone finally forgave you, because I believe those stories matter, and I believe sharing them helps someone else out there find the courage to mend something they've been carrying alone. Healing rarely happens all at once. It happens in small conversations on park benches, in phone calls we've been too afraid to make for years, in porches where families finally decide that the truth, however late, is worth more than the comfortable silence we've been living in. It has been almost a year now since Poppy pointed across that gymnasium and whispered the words that cracked open a decade of silence, and I want to tell you honestly that not everything has resolved into some perfect, tidy ending, because real life rarely works that way, but so much has changed that I sometimes catch myself standing in my own kitchen, marveling at it. Vivian and I have been slowly, carefully rebuilding something between us, not rushing to call it anything more than what it honestly is yet, a friendship built on the wreckage of an old love, tender in the way a healed bone is tender, strong in the places that matter and still a little careful in the places that used to hurt the worst. She comes to dinner most Sundays now, and Poppy has taken to calling her Miss Vivian, with a possessive kind of pride that makes my chest ache in the best possible way, and my father, in his own quiet, gruff manner, has begun inviting her to family gatherings too, a small act of restitution that means more coming from him than any words ever could. Callum has forgiven himself slowly, the way most of us have to, in pieces, over time, through the ordinary work of showing up differently than he used to, and he and Vivian have had their own difficult, necessary conversation, one that ended, against my quiet fears, not in more anger but in something closer to peace, because Vivian, it turns out, has always had a gift for extending grace to people who genuinely try to earn it back. My father visits Vivian's mother now more often than he used to, two elderly people who lived through the same small-town scandal from opposite sides of it, finding, in their later years, an unexpected companionship in simply having survived it. And Poppy, my sharp-eyed, unstoppable daughter, has no idea that her single, unguarded whisper in a school gymnasium set into motion the undoing of 11 years of silence, the reconciliation of two brothers, the quiet mending of a father's guilt, and the slow, careful rebuilding of a love everyone, including me, had long since assumed was buried for good. I think about that photograph sometimes, the one still tucked in my dresser drawer, two young people soaked from swimming in Miller's Creek, believing without question that the world owed them nothing but happiness. I know now that the world does not work that way, that it hands out grief and misunderstanding and cowardice in equal measure with joy, but I also know something I did not fully understand at 26 years old, which is that the story does not end where the wound happens. It only ends where we finally decide to stop carrying it alone. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, whoever you are, wherever you are sitting as you read these words, it is that it is never too late to say the true thing you have been too afraid to say, whether that truth is an apology, a confession, or simply the quiet admission that you were wrong about someone you loved. Second chances rarely announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive in a school gymnasium on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in the small, fearless voice of a child who does not yet know enough about the world to be afraid of the truth, pointing at a stranger and whispering the words that change everything. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the lesson or the feeling that stayed with you most, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about kindness, forgiveness, and the second chances we so rarely believe we still deserve. Thank you for spending this time with our family's story, and thank you for believing, alongside our community, that it is never too late for the truth to finally set someone free.